Hello and welcome to the Treasured Page podcast. I'm Melanie and this is our quiet crafting space. And today this is episode 10 of the Junk Journaling podcast. Come snuggle in, settle in. It's a very rainy, wet day here in southern England. And that is where I'm coming to you from. I'm in my craft room, sat at my desk in a very lovely, comfy chair, one that I've just acquired. I think it's really important to make sure that you are comfortable when you settle down to crafting. So just as much as getting your quiet crafting space all organised, just as much as making sure you've got the things all around you and your desk area all settled in, you do need a really good seat. You need a nice chair, something comfy. Make sure you've got a cushion on it because you could be sat here for some time. It may be that this becomes your happy place, and in which case you want to make it as cozy and as comfortable as possible. So today's topic is going to be scraps, the scrap tray, the importance of a scrap tray. What is it? Why do we need it? Is that a good starting point? Absolutely. The scrap tray is one of my most treasured possessions amongst my junk journaling supplies. So without the scraps, I feel that I probably couldn't do all of the projects that I do. They're a starting place and they're a finishing place. The scrap tray is somewhere where I can throw the remnants of a project in and I can decide in the moment there and then whether I think that is going to be useful in another project. And in doing that very quick assessment of whether that piece of paper or that trim or that lace, that bit of fabric, whether that is going to be useful in the future, I've already done the work for myself when it comes to sitting down and looking at my scraps. So when I want to work with little shards of paper, fragments of interesting bits that I could collage with, if I've already made the decision that it's a worthwhile piece, I can then just trust my creative self from the past, and I can then just pick up those scraps knowing that they are useful and I would be able to create something with them. So the scrap tray is ever present on my table and I do have it in front of me. It can be tucked under something else. I've got a desk stand here which is designed for a computer monitor, and underneath is where my scrap tray lives. It also has a couple of drawers and I love to have my acrylic blocks there for rubber stamps and silicone stamps, and I like to have my ink pads close at hand, and I use a Tim Holtz distress range for some of my junk journaling projects. But the scrap tray is brilliant. It's a place where it's a good starting point. So it's a place where I can pull from and have a look at what I've got. I can have a look at the past projects that I've been making, and I can see future ones emerging amongst the mixture, the sort of the wonderful. It's like going into a sweet shop and choosing all the pick a mix. That's what I mean. A pick a mix of scraps is what you need. So whether that's a basket, whether that's a shallow tray, whether that's a box that you have tucked away on the shelf, that's fine. Just do make sure that you've got a few scraps to pull from. And then what I have found in the past, now I'm not suggesting you do this for all time, but have a good look at your scraps. And there is a video on my playlist somewhere about supplies, I think, where I have a look at arranging my scraps into categories. Well, that sounds maybe unnecessary. Scraps are scraps, right? We should be able to just pull from them willy-nilly. Absolutely. But if you have a look at your scraps, really look at your scraps, you will start to see how you choose your scraps, and it'll be different for everybody. I have scraps that are neutral in colour, and so it's worthwhile sort of having a look at them to put them in a rough category. So maybe plain scraps. So those are scraps that are nice paper, but they haven't got anything on them. So it's really about the texture and the quality of the paper. Is it an old vintage piece of paper? Is it a handmade paper? Could there be extra fibres that have been added to the paper to give it texture, to give it that lovely tactile feel? Is it embossed paper, but it's still plain in colour? So it's a cream or a neutral tone, but it's got embossed patterning on it. Could it have been pierced or have a hole in it? What's going on for that piece of paper? So that could be its own separate category. That could be textured paper that's plain. Then so you've got your neutral tones that are just flat and normal. You've got your textured neutrals, and then you've got other patterned papers. So whether they're scraps of scrapbooking paper, so you've got some nice decorative florals or images on there, they could go in another category because they're coloured. They've got different colours, vibrant. Some are bright, some are light. Do you want to put those in a separate category and have a look at your bright, colourful scraps as one complete pile? And I'm not suggesting you do this all the time, but just certainly as an exercise, it's really interesting to work out exactly what you've got. It's worthwhile taking a handful of your scraps if you've got a whole bucket or bin or a real large amount of them. Just take a handful and work through them. What sort of scraps do you discard? Do you work with quite big pieces or little tiny pieces? Can you reduce it down to just a lot of little tiny pieces and take out the bigger scraps and maybe store those in a folder? I store my larger scraps in a tin, a flat tin, and that's quite a nice go-to place because it slots in the shelf. It can go on a bookshelf. It doesn't take up much space. It's flat and I can rummage through that when I want a larger piece. And that could be all sorts of different kinds of paper, whether it's handmade, homemade, whether it's print, book page, old book page, vintage book page, antique book page, music papers in sheet music. All of those things, they're all lovely, and I keep them as bigger sheets. If they are bigger sheets, they have their own separate area. But when we're talking about scraps, I'm meaning the 2-inch by 3 or 5-inch, those sort of scraps that are useful to stick down in the background. So they're not shouting for your attention because they're not bright. They've not got a lot of patterning on them because they're quite neutral in tone. Those are your good go-to scraps for background collage, and then you would build up interest on the top. So you would layer up, looking for intriguing, maybe vintage ephemera that you would bring in, such as letters or ledger, old papers from the past. All of those scraps are going to be intriguing and wonderful to look at in a detailed collage. So those scraps could be put in a pile of more interesting top layer scraps. And just think how you might want to organise your scraps into these piles. What piles would you choose for your scraps? So neutrals, patterns, ephemera, and then maybe bright colours and textures. I've got scraps that are fabrics, so you could have a pile for fabric scraps. I've got see-through or transparent papers such as tracing paper, but it's got a print on it, vellum and deli papers, scraps of intriguing, what's this one? Baking paper, for instance, parchment paper. Then I've got my coffee stains, my tea stains, my botanical dyes, things like onion papers and onion dye papers, avocado dye papers. I've got fibred papers that have had little silk threads thrown into the mix when they've been made. I've got wallpaper which has got texture on, or it's a bit thicker, so that's of interest. It looks nice when it's put down in a collage. Then I've got old vintage dictionary. I've got some script from a different country, so it's got a foreign text on it, which is interesting. I've got Japanese and Chinese scripts, ancient and modern. I've got lined paper, ruled paper, college rule, and graph paper. Oh gosh, so many different kinds of papers when you start looking at it. Architect's paper, things that you can get hold of, thin paper, thick paper, artist paper, watercolor paper, oil painting paper, lots of different weights, tissue paper, shoe paper, paper. When I mean shoe paper, I mean paper that is used to stuff into the shoes, new shoes that you get. Maybe that's a recycled paper, so it's more porous. All the different textures, all the different weights, whether it's a shiny surface to a matte finish and anything in between. Whether that allows water to seep through, whether it's waterproof. Could it be a wax paper? Could it be a paper that has had some form of embossing applied to it, like an embossing powder, not just pressed into a machine. What else have we got? Then vintage sewing pattern paper, that's its own paper. And tea bag paper, that's another paper. Paper. Oh, we could go on for hours. Then there's paper that you might have decorated in the process of putting down ink or stenciling and collaging with papers where you've maybe sprayed it with a specialty ink, for instance, like Tim Holtz Distress ink sprays. And maybe you've got paint splatters or drop sheets where you've been painting, but some of the splats have ended up on the paper that you're using to keep your table or your desk free of paint splatters. That paper can be torn up and used in collage. Maybe you like to use tissue paper with a jelly print, and you're therefore using acrylic paint and you're rolling off your roller over onto some spare paper, and that is creating an interesting texture as the roller goes over the top of the paper. What kind of paper are you using? That could be tissue paper, it could be maybe painter's masking paper, that's a thin paper. It could be the packaging from delivery paper, that porous but thick brown craft paper. That's just some of the papers we can get our hands on. And then there's speciality writing papers with all the different images and patterns that you can see within. Sometimes they're bright and bold, but other times they've been muted and more transparent, but you can see that they're there. In vintage ephemera holders, such as stamp collecting, you might get a tissue paper that was there to protect the photographs or the stamps. If you've got anything like that, that's wonderful, particularly if you can find the embossed glassine. So that's amazing. We can't find that these days. That's very hard. But glassine paper bags are still available, and that's another paper that you might have, particularly if you're tearing up scraps there. So you'll find that there's lots and lots of translucent papers and different weights and thicknesses, and you'll find that you're going to have scraps of those. If the more you collect and look at your incoming junk and rubbish and things that you would probably end up recycling or not wanting to use, old packaging, particularly at holiday times or birthdays and things, you'll get receiving a gift, you'll get gift wrap paper. So you might have little torn bits of that you might want to keep because it was lovely or special and you can see a value and a use in it, and you held on to the paper. That would maybe go in another category if it's thin but patterned. So what categories would you have for your scraps? I'm just looking at mine. I've got scraps that are off digital kits where I've been printing off of the computer images that I like and images that I want to work with, something that tells a story that I want to have in my journal. And so I might have autumn and fall at the moment, or I might have spring and summer. I've got a little image here with fallen leaves, and that's quite nice, but I haven't used all of it. So therefore I've got these scraps. I've got some card making papers, quite nice commercial paper, but it is just a scrap and it's got a torn edge, but it's nice. It's grey and it's got a polka dot on it. So it's still a neutral because it's not bright, but it does have the polka dot pattern. So that could still go with my neutrals, but be patterned. So patterned neutrals. That's another category. Where do we end? I've got Japanese paper. I've got lovely floral script, but that is in a pale green on a cream background. So that's quite neutral. So that's its own little category, these neutral text paper. Book page paper. I've got book print and I've got old-fashioned script. I've got map paper. Every paper seems to be slightly different. This feels quite dense in its consistency, and it is vintage as well, so it's got the aging spots on it. What else have I got in my tray here? So I've got old vintage dictionary and thesaurus paper, which is very, very thin, and I love that. So we've got scraps of that. And then Ordnance Survey map that has been folded, and maybe some torn up old envelope where the inside has got a crisscross pattern in a blue. I've got teabag paper, handmade paper, tracing paper, cardstock, newspaper, magazine paper, and greeting card. I think that might be all the papers that I have on my desk. Oh, not forgetting, of course, doily paper, where there's sort of a lacework holes in it. Maybe that's been printed out, laser printed, or die cut paper. So there we go. There's all sorts of papers and categories that you would find, from whether it's got printed text on it, patterns, images, and texture. So you would then separate all of that out, and from there you can start to see how you collect, why you collect, and how it could be used in an application such as a collage or building up a page in your journal. So familiarising yourself with your scraps definitely helps you when it comes to a collage and pulling a collage together. And if you know where to draw from and what different scraps you've got, it certainly is a good exercise, even if you don't stick to the organisation of your scraps, because let's face it, life's too short. But you may just be interested to know how you collect things, and whether you collect sort of world papers that from around the world, and maybe they've got different textures and a different feel, a different quality, or a writing or a language. And those are the ones that are interesting. If they are interesting to you, then they will be interesting to others. And I think that's a good place to start thinking that will be one of your top layers for a collage. And those are the pieces that you would perhaps draw from towards the end of your collage piece, whereas the plainer pieces in neutral tones would be a good base layer of a collage. There would be the starting point. And once you've organised that, then a collage sort of starts to take care of itself, because you lay down your less interesting pieces, and then you maybe build in some texture on a second layer, and then maybe your top layer, depending how many layers you want, and that's completely up to you as a creator. Your top layer would maybe have the vintage ephemera, or the interesting patterns, the textures, and the images. And on the very top of everything, we call a focal point, which may be something that you have spent time cutting out of a book page, or a digital kit and have fussy cut around, and that becomes a focal point, the thing that sets the tone, the theme of your overall collage. Might be a flower, it might be a bird, a butterfly, an animal. It could be a tree or anything that you've chosen as the main focus, your focal point. And then all the other pieces of your collage melt into the background. But wherever you look, there's something of interest. And that's how to do a really good collage. And it does start with the scraps. And if you've understood what scraps you've got in the first place, you can understand how to build up an interesting collage piece that you may want to add to a tag, or you may want to add to a page in your journal. And it's just interesting when you start having a look at the papers that you're bringing into your home or that are coming through the door via junk mail or envelopes. What little element on there is interesting to maybe want to keep? Is there a pretty picture, an image, a texture or a pattern that you feel that you could maybe tear off and add to your scrap tray or box, and something to grab from when you are creating? It's often a free resource and it's perfect for junk journaling, but understanding what scraps you've got around you and why you've kept them is a really, really good exercise to begin with, because it speeds up the decision process when you are creating. You can look at it and you think, oh, that's a world scrap. Oh, that's a neutral scrap. That's a textured scrap. I'll keep that because I know that that is going to form a part of my next collage piece. My next masterpiece could use this little scrap, this tiny shard of Italian paper with a pattern on it. And then when you have that as a collection, you feel like you can pull from that resource, and it's an excellent supply, and one to realise you're never going to get to the end of. If you are a regular crafter, you'll find that you have boxes and boxes of it, and therefore you can go through some of that, be discerning. How much do you actually need? How many boxes of neutral scraps do you need? No, you don't really need that much, because you're always going to have neutral scraps coming through. So unless it's a vintage paper from the 1700s, you might want to say goodbye to some of that. And the best thing you can do is see if you've got any local gardeners and see if you can give that to their compost. Yes, so paper scraps can go into a compost bin or they can go into a recycle bin. You don't have to feel bad about throwing things away, because paper will rot down and it will become at one with the earth, so we are okay with that. Fabric scraps, you might find that they're more precious, but also have a look at them. Do they make your heart sing? Do they make you feel joy? And if not, then maybe those things could go as well. They will rot down and they will not cause a problem to our planet in the future. There's no point in hanging on to them unless you want to sew them together and make something amazing. You can also think that you can put any colour scrap down and you can always paint over the top of it with a gesso paint of white or a black paint, and you would then have a textured background. So there's lots of ways around your scraps and what to do with them. If you've got so many scraps that you just couldn't ever in your lifetime be able to create that much, then it's too much and it's overwhelming. So let them go and only keep the scraps that are really, really special, because then your next artwork pieces, your next junk journaling tags or tickets or ephemera pieces will be really interesting. So go through your scraps as an exercise and just have a little look at a cross section of what you've got and decide, am I keeping the right thing? And if you're not, then make a conscious effort to keep hold of the things that you only want for the future, for future craft sessions, and throw away the others in a sensible way by composting them or however you see fit for a recycling purpose. And just keep a check on it. Don't let them mount up too much, and be a connoisseur of your scraps. That's the aim of the game. Well, so that's what to do with your scraps and the importance of them. It's a massive subject, one we haven't got time to go into today, but we certainly have a starting point of having a look at them, choosing the ones that we definitely want, and then moving forwards, making sure we only keep the ones that we really, really love and ones that fit into the categories that we have in our mind now. Because you've got your neutrals, your textures, your patterns, you've got your bright colours, your paler colours, and then you've got vintage ephemera, text and script and music paper, all perfect, and then fabric pieces as well, trim, lace and the like. So there we go, guys. Just make sure that you keep only the things that really, really bring happiness to you and let everything else go. There is no point in hanging on to it. It is only going to drag you down, overwhelm you, and ultimately not give you the creative energy that you need to carry on. So junk journaling is fine, providing you don't let it swamp you. So only keep the things that you need and love as much as you can, and then everything else, find somewhere else for them to go that's beneficial to the planet. Okay, guys, thank you very much for listening. I'm Melanie. This is the Treasured Page podcast, and do please check out my videos on the Treasured Page YouTube channel for more inspiration. And I will be with you on Thursday with the next podcast, and thank you very much for listening. Above everything else, guys, just slow down and make crafting time for you. Bye-bye now.